September 16th, 1857. You're tied to the mouth of a cannon. Your back is pressed against cold metal. Your arms and legs are bound to the wheels. British soldiers stand in formation around you. Behind them, your family watches. The officer in charge reads your sentence. Rebellion. Treason against the crown. The fuse is lit. This isn't fiction. This is documented British execution protocol during the Indian Rebellion of 1857. It's called blowing from a gun, and it was designed not just to kill you, but to destroy your soul. Here's how it worked, and why the British Empire systematized it across India. Act 1. The machinery of terror. Let's be clear about what the British were facing in 1857. The Indian Rebellion, called the Sepoy Mutiny by the British, had shaken the foundation of colonial rule. Indian soldiers in the British East India Company's army had revolted. They'd killed British officers, seized cities, and declared the restoration of Mughal rule. The British response wasn't just to suppress the rebellion. It was to ensure that no Indian would ever dare rebel again. They needed executions that would terrify not just the condemned, but everyone who witnessed them. So they systematized horror. Blowing from a gun became official execution protocol in August 1857. A British military order preserved in the India Office records in the British Library codified the procedure. Rebels convicted of treason shall be tied to the muzzle of a 9-pound cannon and executed by discharge. Executions shall be conducted in public. Bodies shall not be given to families for burial. That last line is critical, because the British understood something about Indian religious culture. Disposal of the body according to ritual is essential. Hindus require cremation. Muslims require burial with the body intact. Blowing someone apart with a cannon destroys the body completely, makes proper funeral rites impossible. The British weren't just killing people. They were destroying their afterlife. Think about the level of calculated cruelty that requires. You're not fighting an army anymore. You're waging psychological warfare against an entire population's belief system. This wasn't random violence. This was policy. If you believe that the documented records of imperial brutality must be remembered, consider liking this video and subscribing. Your support helps us uncover more accounts from the darkest corners of the human story. Now let's walk through what a blowing from a gun execution actually looked like, because the mechanics reveal the full horror. Act 2. The execution process. The condemned man or woman, the British executed women this way too, is brought to an open field, usually the center of a town or village. The cannon is positioned so that the maximum number of people can watch. British soldiers force the crowd to attend. If you're a family member, you have to watch. If you're a villager, you have to watch. If you refuse, you're suspected of rebel sympathy. The cannon is loaded with powder but no projectile. The condemned person is tied to the muzzle face first. Arms and legs spread and bound to the cannon wheels. An officer reads the sentence, the charges, the verdict. Then the fuse is lit. Here's what happens when a 9-pound cannon discharges at point-blank range into a human body. The blast doesn't just kill you. It disintegrates you. Your torso is vaporized instantly. Your arms and legs are blown in different directions, sometimes landing hundreds of feet away. Your head usually remains somewhat intact but is blasted backward. What's left isn't a body, it's pieces. Contemporary accounts describe the aftermath. A British officer named George Campbell witnessed multiple executions and wrote in his memoirs, "Portions of the wretches were scattered in every direction. A leg here, an arm there, the head in one place, and other parts of the body in another." Another British soldier, William Howard Russell, a journalist for the Times of London, described it more bluntly. The smoke cleared, and there was nothing left but fragments. The ground was red. The spectators wept openly, but were forced to remain until given leave to depart. The British didn't allow families to collect the remains. The pieces were left in the field for animals to scavenge or buried in unmarked pits. Think about what this does psychologically, not just to the condemned, but to the witnesses. You watch someone you know, a neighbor, a brother, a father tied to a cannon. You watch the smoke, you watch the explosion, and then you're forced to stare at the pieces while British soldiers stand guard making sure you don't move. You're not just witnessing an execution, you're being taught a lesson. This is what happens when you defy the Empire. But here's where the British execution machinery reveals its true sophistication. Blowing from a gun wasn't the only method. It was part of a system. Act 3. The hierarchy of executions. The British developed different execution methods for different classes of rebels. Each method carried symbolic meaning. For high-ranking rebels, princes, landowners, military leaders, hanging was used. Public hanging in the town square. The body was left dangling for days as a warning. Why hanging for elites? Because in Victorian British culture, hanging was the civilized execution method. It sent a message. You're being treated according to British law. You're being absorbed into the Empire even in death. For common soldiers who'd rebelled, sepoys blowing from a gun was standard. Mass executions. Dozens of men executed in a single day. British records document execution events where 15 to 20 men were blown from guns in sequence. One cannon, one after another. For hours, the crowd was forced to watch the entire event. But here's where it gets even darker. For women accused of aiding the rebellion, the British used a different method. Public flogging followed by imprisonment. Women weren't blown from guns not because of mercy but because of Victorian moral sensibilities. The British couldn't reconcile their self-image as civilized with the visual of a woman being blown apart. So instead, women were stripped to the waist and flogged publicly. The number of lashes ranged from 50 to 200. 200 lashes with a military whip will flay skin from bone. British soldier Thomas Lowe described one such flogging. The woman's back was entirely laid open. She did not cry out, which seemed to infuriate the officer. He ordered 50 additional lashes. By the end, she was unconscious. I do not know if she survived. After flogging, women were imprisoned in conditions designed to ensure slow death. Overcrowded cells, no medical care, minimal food. British prison records from 1857 to 1859 show mortality rates of 60-80 among imprisoned women rebels. This wasn't punishment. This was extermination with plausible deniability. The British could claim they didn't execute women, they just imprisoned them in conditions that killed them. Think about the bureaucratic precision of this system. Different execution methods for different social classes. Documentation of every execution. Reports filed with colonial administrators. Statistics tracked. Methods refined based on effectiveness. The British East India Company ran the rebellion suppression like a corporate project. And it worked. If this moment in history doesn't move you to learn more, you might be missing the lesson our ancestors died to teach. That the most effective atrocities aren't chaotic, they're organized. Now, let's talk about the scale. Because this wasn't a few isolated executions. Act 4. The numbers between May 1857 and December 1859, the British executed approximately 100,000 Indians for rebellion or suspected rebel sympathies. That number comes from British military records, parliamentary inquiries, and Indian documentation compiled by historians in the 20th century. 100,000 people in 30 months. That's an average of 111 executions per day. Some days were worse. After the British retook Delhi in September 1857, mass executions continued for weeks. A British officer named Edward V. Bart wrote in his diary, "Every tree in the city seemed to bear its burden of dead." The phrase "its burden of dead" is doing a lot of work there. He's describing mass hanging so extensive that trees collapsed under the weight of bodies. But the executions weren't chaotic revenge killings. They were processed through military tribunals. British officers held court. Evidence was presented, often just an accusation from a loyalist. A sentence was passed. The execution was carried out within hours. It was industrialized death. British colonial administrator William Muir later wrote, "We were not administering justice. We were administering terror." The trials were formalities. The outcome was predetermined. Here's what makes this especially sinister. The British documented everything. Execution lists, names, ages, villages, methods, filed in triplicate, sent to London, archived. For decades, historians couldn't access these records. The British government classified them. When they were finally released in the late 20th century, researchers discovered the full scope. The British hadn't just executed rebels, they'd executed suspected sympathizers. People who'd fed rebels, people who'd hidden rebels, people who'd simply been in the wrong village at the wrong time. One document lists a man executed for possessing a sword, a family heirloom, not a weapon of rebellion. Another lists a 14-year-old boy executed for carrying messages. He was a runner for the village, carrying all kinds of messages, not just rebel communications. The British cast the net wide, and the machinery processed everyone caught inside. By 1859, the rebellion was crushed completely, but the executions continued. The British kept executing suspected rebels for months after active fighting ended. Why? Because the goal wasn't just to end the rebellion. It was to break the will to rebel ever again. Epilogue. The erasure after the rebellion, the British Crown took direct control of India from the East India Company. The company was dissolved, and then the systematic erasure began. British historians writing in the late 19th century reframed the rebellion as the Sepoy Mutiny, a localized uprising by disgruntled soldiers, not a widespread independence movement. They minimized the scale of executions. British textbooks referred to necessary measures to restore order. The specific methods, blowing from guns, mass hangings, public floggings, were rarely described in detail. For a century, British schoolchildren learned about the Indian Mutiny as a footnote, a minor disruption in the glorious story of empire. Meanwhile, in India, the stories were passed down by oral histories, family memories, songs. But without access to British archives, the full documentation remained hidden. It wasn't until Indian independence in 1947 that historians began reconstructing the full scale of British atrocities. And even then, it took decades. The British government didn't release execution records until the 1970s and 1980s. When they did, Indian historians like Amaresh Misra and Rudrangshu Mukherjee began compiling the evidence. What they found was worse than oral histories had preserved. The systematization, the bureaucracy, the industrial efficiency of it all. The British hadn't just suppressed a rebellion brutally. They'd created execution protocols, refined them through practice, documented them, and implemented them across an entire subcontinent. This was empire at its most honest, not the myth of civilizing missions in British justice, the reality of calculated terror deployed to maintain control. Here's what haunts me about this story. The British officers who ordered these executions, men like General Neil, Colonel James Neil, Hugh Wheeler, were celebrated as heroes in Britain. They received medals, promotions, pensions. General Neil was killed during the rebellion and became a martyr. Statues were erected in his honor in England. His execution methods were never mentioned in the commemorations. It took until 2020 for a statue of him in Scotland to be removed after public pressure. Meanwhile, the 100,000 Indians executed by the British have no collective memorial, no monument. Many don't even have names in historical records, just numbers in execution logs. The British preserved meticulous documentation of how they killed people, but not always who those people were. That's erasure of a different kind. You exist in history only as a statistic in your oppressor's files. The question isn't just why the British used these methods. It's why they were so meticulous about documenting them, and then why they hid that documentation for over a century. The answer is uncomfortable, because they knew what they'd done. They knew it was systematic brutality. And they knew that if the full scope became public, the myth of the civilizing British Empire would collapse. So they classified the records, rewrote the textbooks, and taught generations of British students a sanitized version of history. It's only now, decades after the empire ended, that the full documentation is coming to light, and it reveals something terrifying. The British Empire didn't just conquer through military force. It conquered through industrialized terror, implemented with bureaucratic precision, and then erased from official memory. How many other colonial atrocities are still classified? How many other execution logs are sitting in archives, waiting to be discovered? If this exposed something you've never heard before, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we're going to keep uncovering the history they tried to erase. Drop a comment with your thoughts and I'll see you in the next investigation. The machinery doesn't stop, but neither do we.